The apartment felt smaller after David left. Not physically, the same four walls, the same narrow hallway that led from the living room to the bedroom, the same kitchen window that looked out onto the fire escape. But something had shifted in the Wyanquarte, like the air itself had thinned. His books were gone from the shelves, his coffee mug no longer sat in the sink, and the indent his body had made in my mattress had finally sprung back to its original shape. 3 months of living alone had taught me that silence could be both a comfort and a weight. I'd gotten used to the quiet, to the way my footsteps echoed against hardwood floors, to the sound of my own breathing as I worked at my desk by the window. But the walls still held the ghosts of our arguments, the places where his fist had left small dents in the drywall during our final fight. Every morning I'd see those marks and feel something twist in my chest. Not longing exactly, but a dull ache that reminded me of everything I'd been trying to forget. That's when I decided the apartment needed to change. If I couldn't escape the memories, maybe I could paint over them. I found his number on a bulletin board at the coffee shop on Bleecker Street. M. Santos, interior painting, reliable and professional. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind that suggested someone who took time with details. I called that afternoon, surprised when he answered on the second ring. Santos, his voice was low, rough around the edges like he'd just woken up. "Hi, I saw your number at Joe's Coffee. I need someone to paint my apartment." A pause. "How many rooms?" "Studio. Well, it's got a separate bedroom, but it's small, maybe 800 square feet total." "When were you thinking?" "Soon, this week, if possible." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of the city. "I can come by tomorrow afternoon, take a look, give you an estimate." "That works. What's the address?" I gave it to him along with my name, Alex, and my apartment number. He repeated it back in that same steady voice, and I found myself paying attention to the way he shaped the words, careful and deliberate. "See you tomorrow, Alex." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone for a moment longer than necessary, wondering what I'd just set in motion. He arrived exactly when he said he would, 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt heavy with the promise of rain. I'd spent the morning cleaning, not because the apartment was particularly messy, but because having a stranger in my space felt like exposing something private. I'd moved my laptop from the kitchen table, stacked the books that had been scattered around the living room, and hidden the empty wine bottles that had accumulated on the counter over the past few weeks. The knock was soft but firm. When I opened the door, I was struck first by his size. Not tall, maybe 5'10", but solid in a way that suggested physical work. Dark hair, longer on top and slightly mussed. Brown eyes that took in my face, then looked past me into the apartment with quiet assessment. He wore work clothes, faded jeans, and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days, and carried a small notebook in one hand. "Miguel Santos," he said, extending his other hand. His grip was warm, calloused, brief. "Alex, come in." He stepped inside, and I watched as his eyes moved around the space, the exposed brick wall, the tall windows, the way the afternoon light cut across the hardwood floors. He didn't say anything at first, just looked, and I found myself seeing the apartment through his eyes. The way the paint was chipped around the window frames, how the white walls had taken on a dingy gray tint over the years, the small holes where David's artwork used to hang. "What were you thinking color-wise?" he asked, pulling a pencil from behind his ear. "I don't know. Something different, not white," he nodded, making a note. "Any rooms you want to keep the same?" "No, all of it." He looked at me, then really looked, and I felt something shift in the air between us. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged in a way I hadn't expected. His gaze lingered for just a moment too long before he turned back to his notebook. "Mind if I take measurements?" For the next 20 minutes, he moved through the apartment with quiet efficiency. He measured walls, examined the baseboards, checked the condition of the existing paint. I tried to give him space, settling at my desk with my laptop open, but I found myself watching him work. There was something meditative about the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried. When he crouched down to inspect the corner where the living room met the kitchen, I noticed the way his jeans pulled tight across his thighs, the curve of his back under the cotton shirt. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the blank document on my screen. I had a freelance article due by Friday, something about sustainable architecture that I'd been struggling to write for weeks. But the words wouldn't come. They hadn't been coming for months now, not since David left and my world had narrowed to these four walls and the endless cycle of coffee, takeout, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling. "You a writer?" I looked up. Miguel was standing near my desk, close enough that I could smell something clean and warm, soap maybe, or laundry detergent. He was looking at the stack of books beside my laptop, the notebook where I kept story ideas, the half-empty coffee cup with the newspaper logo printed on the side. "Freelance journalist, mostly boring stuff." "Like what?" "Architecture, urban planning, sometimes profiles of people doing interesting things with small spaces." I gestured around the apartment. Ironic, considering. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "This is a good space, good bones." "Thanks. It's been home for about 3 years." "You live alone?" The question was casual, but something in his tone made me pause. "Yeah, for a few months now." He nodded, not pushing for details, and I was grateful. I wasn't ready to explain David, to talk about the way relationships could unravel slowly and then all at once, leaving you wondering how you'd miss the signs. "I can start Thursday," he said, closing his notebook. "Should take about a week, maybe less. I work clean, but you'll want to move anything valuable." "How much?" He named a price that was fair, maybe even generous. I told him yes without hesitation, and we shook hands again. This time I noticed the paint stains under his fingernails, the small scar that ran across his knuckles. Working hands. "Color," he said as he headed toward the door. "Think about what you want to feel when you walk in here." After he left, I sat in the quiet apartment and tried to imagine what that might be. What did I want to feel? For months, I'd been numb, moving through my days like I was underwater. I wanted to feel awake again. I wanted to feel like I was living instead of just existing. I wanted to feel like myself. Thursday morning came gray and drizzle-soft. I'd spent the previous day moving furniture to the center of each room, covering everything with old sheets and plastic drop cloths Miguel had left for me. The apartment looked strange, transformed into something temporary and unfamiliar. I'd chosen colors finally. A warm gray for the living room and bedroom, deep blue for the kitchen, cream for the small bathroom. Safe choices, maybe, but they felt right. Miguel arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying paint cans and a toolbox that looked like it had seen decades of use. He'd traded the gray t-shirt for a white tank top, and I tried not to notice the way it showed off his arms, the definition in his shoulders as he lifted the supplies. "Coffee?" I offered, hovering in the kitchen doorway as he set up his equipment. "That'd be good." I made a pot stronger than I usually preferred and poured 2 cups. He accepted his with a nod of thanks, wrapping both hands around the mug like he was cold. "You don't have to stay," he said after a moment. "Some people prefer to be out while I work." "I work from home. I'll try to stay out of your way." "Doesn't bother me." We stood there for a moment, drinking coffee in companionable silence. Outside, the rain had started in earnest, drumming against the windows with steady persistence. The apartment felt smaller with both of us in it, but not claustrophobic, just present, like the space was holding its breath. "I'll start with the bedroom," he said finally. "Give you the living room for your office." I nodded and he disappeared down the hallway with his supplies. Soon I could hear the sounds of preparation, the scrape of plastic being laid out, the pop of paint can lids, the rustle of brushes and rollers. I settled at my desk with my laptop, determined to make progress on the architecture article, but found myself distracted by the rhythm of his work. He painted with the same deliberate care he'd shown while measuring. I could hear the steady stroke of the brush along the walls, the occasional pause as he reloaded with paint. No music, no humming, just the quiet focus of someone who understood their craft. By lunchtime, I'd managed to write maybe 3 paragraphs. Every time I found my groove, some sound from the bedroom would pull my attention away. Not because it was loud, but because there was something hypnotic about knowing he was there, transforming my space with careful precision. I made sandwiches, turkey and Swiss, on bread that was probably a day too old. When I knocked on the bedroom door frame, he was kneeling by the baseboards, brush in hand, touching up the places where the wall met the floor. The gray I'd chosen looked different on the walls than it had on the paint chip, warmer, softer, like morning fog. Lunch? He looked up, and I noticed a small smear of paint on his cheek, gray against tan skin. Thanks. We ate at the kitchen table, or what was left of it under the drop cloths. The rain continued outside, turning the apartment dim and cozy. I watched him eat, neat, economical bites, no wasted motion. How long have you been painting? I asked. 10 years, maybe more. Started helping my uncle when I was in college. What did you study? Art, actually. He smiled at that, self-deprecating. Figured I'd be the next Basquiat or something. Turns out I'm better at making other people's walls beautiful. Do you still paint? Your own stuff, I mean. Sometimes, not much lately. There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, so I let it drop. We finished eating in comfortable silence, and he returned to work. I tried again with the article, managed another paragraph, then gave up and decided to read instead. I was deep in a novel when I felt eyes on me. I looked up to find Miguel standing in the living room doorway watching me. He didn't look away when our gazes met, didn't offer an excuse or explanation, just stood there, paint-stained and still, studying me with those dark eyes. What? I asked, suddenly self-conscious. Nothing, just, you read like you're somewhere else. Isn't that the point? Yeah, I guess it is. He went back to work, but I couldn't concentrate on the book anymore. I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, like he was seeing something I didn't know I was showing. It made me feel exposed and invisible at the same time. The afternoon passed in a haze of quiet activity. He finished the bedroom and moved to the bathroom, and I relocated to the living room couch with my laptop. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray, pressing close to the windows. I managed to write a few more paragraphs, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds from the bathroom: water running, the scrape of sandpaper, the soft whisper of brush against wall. Around 4, he emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. The cream paint in the bathroom had brightened the small space, made it feel larger and cleaner. Looks good, I said, peering past him. It's coming together. I made more coffee, and we stood in the kitchen again, the same ritual as the morning. But something had shifted. The air felt thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. When he reached past me to set his cup in the sink, his arm brushed against mine, and I felt the contact like electricity. You always live this quiet? He asked, leaning against the counter. The question caught me off guard. I considered lying, telling him I was naturally introverted, that I'd always preferred solitude. But there was something in his expression that invited honesty. Only since it stopped feeling lonely. He studied my face, and I had the strange sensation that he could see through me, past the careful walls I'd built over the past few months. When did that happen? Recently? He nodded like he understood, like he'd been there himself. We stood in the kitchen as the light outside began to fade, two strangers who were somehow not strangers at all, connected by something neither of us had words for. I should let you finish up, I said finally, though I didn't want the moment to end. Yeah, I'll be done soon. But he didn't move, and neither did I. We stayed there in the growing dusk, the silence stretching between us like a held breath. I could smell the paint on his clothes, see the tiredness around his eyes, count the paint flecks in his dark hair. He was beautiful in a way that wasn't polished or deliberate, rough around the edges, authentic, real. When he finally did move, gathering his brushes and cleaning his supplies, I felt the absence like a physical thing. I watched him pack up his equipment, noticed the careful way he sealed the paint cans, how he folded the drop cloths with military precision. Same time tomorrow? He asked as he headed for the door. Yeah, see you then. After he left, I walked through the transformed spaces. The bedroom felt like a different room entirely, peaceful and calm in the gray light. The bathroom was bright and clean, renewed. Even unfinished, the apartment was becoming something new, something that felt more like home than it had in months. But it wasn't just the paint. Something else was changing too. Something inside me that I wasn't ready to examine too closely. I found myself looking forward to tomorrow, to the sound of his footsteps in my hallway, to the quiet rhythm of his work, to the possibility of another conversation in the kitchen, another moment of unexpected connection. I made dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, nothing fancy, and ate it while reading. But I kept glancing toward the door, already impatient for morning to come. Friday brought sunshine, bright and warm after yesterday's rain. I woke early, showered, and made coffee before Miguel arrived. When he knocked, I was ready, already dressed and alert in a way I hadn't been in months. "Morning," he said, carrying fresh supplies. Today he wore a black t-shirt, soft-looking and fitted, and I tried not to stare at the way it moved across his chest as he set down his equipment. "Coffee's ready." "Thanks." The morning ritual was becoming familiar, comforting even. We drank coffee in the kitchen while the light streamed through the windows, and I found myself cataloging the small details, the way he held his cup, the slight rasp in his voice before he was fully awake, the particular shade of brown in his eyes. "Living room today?" I asked. "And the kitchen, if I have time." I nodded and settled at my desk with renewed determination. The architecture article was nearly finished, and I wanted to submit it before the weekend. But as Miguel began preparing the living room walls, I found myself distracted again, hyper-aware of his presence. He worked differently in the larger space, with broader strokes and longer reaches. I watched him roll paint onto the brick wall, the muscles in his back shifting under his shirt. There was something almost meditative about it. The steady rhythm, the way he moved from section to section with practiced efficiency. Around 10, my phone rang. David's name on the screen made my stomach clench. "I should take this," I said, grabbing the phone and stepping onto the small balcony that overlooked the courtyard. "Alex, it's David." "I know. How are you?" The question felt absurd. How was I? I was learning to live alone again, learning to sleep in the center of the bed, learning to make coffee for one. I was having my apartment painted by a stranger who made me feel things I wasn't ready to feel. "Fine. What do you want?" "I left some books there, photography books. They're on the shelf by the window. I was wondering if I could come by and get them." I looked through the sliding door at the covered bookshelf, at Miguel working steadily in the background. "It's not a good time. I'm having work done." "When then?" "I'll drop them off. Where are you staying?" He gave me an address in Brooklyn, somewhere I'd never been. We'd dated for 2 years, lived together for 6 months, and I'd never been to this place that was apparently important enough for him to move to instead of staying with me. "David." "Yeah?" I'd been about to ask why he'd really called, what he actually wanted, but Miguel looked up then, caught my eye through the glass door, and something in his expression made me stop. "Nothing. I'll get you your books." After I hung up, I stood on the balcony for a moment longer, letting the conversation settle. The courtyard below was quiet, just a few pigeons pecking at something near the dumpster. I could hear the city beyond, traffic, voices, the constant hum of 8 million people living their lives, but it felt distant, muted. When I came back inside, Miguel was cleaning his roller, preparing to start on a new wall. "Everything okay?" he asked without looking up. "Ex-boyfriend. He wants his books back." "That's rough." "Not really. We've been broken up for months. I don't know why I kept them." He nodded, understanding without needing details. It was one of the things I was beginning to appreciate about him. The way he didn't push, didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to focus on work, but the call had unsettled me. Memories kept surfacing. David's laugh, the way he used to read in bed on Sunday mornings, how he'd gotten frustrated with my writing schedule, my need for quiet. He'd wanted someone more social, more willing to go out and be seen. I'd wanted someone who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happened in silence. "Hey." I looked up. Miguel was standing beside my desk, close enough that I could see the paint flecks on his forearms, smell the clean scent of his soap. You look like you're somewhere else again, but not the good kind. Just thinking. About him? I nodded, surprised by how easy it was to be honest with him. It's stupid. We weren't right for each other. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, it doesn't. We looked at each other for a moment, and I felt that familiar charge in the air, like the apartment was holding its breath. Then he reached out and touched my shoulder, just briefly, just long enough for me to feel the warmth of his palm through my shirt. Back to work, he said softly, and returned to his painting. But something had shifted again. The touch had been simple, friendly, but it lingered on my skin like a promise. I found myself watching him more openly, studying the line of his profile, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent to reload his brush. He wasn't just painting my walls, he was stripping away everything I thought I'd hidden. Lunch was sandwiches again, but this time we talked more. He told me about growing up in Queens, about his uncle who'd taught him to paint, about the art classes he'd loved in college. I told him about my writing, about the articles that paid the bills, and the stories I wrote for myself, the ones that lived in notebooks and never saw daylight. Why don't you publish them? They're too personal. Isn't that what makes writing good? I'd never thought about it that way. David had always said my personal writing was self-indulgent, too introspective. But Miguel said it like being personal was a strength, not a weakness. After lunch, he started on the kitchen walls, and I moved to the couch with my laptop. The architecture article was finally coming together, the words flowing in a way they hadn't in months. Maybe it was the change of scenery, or maybe it was the steady presence of someone else in my space, but I felt more focused than I had since David left. Around 3, I submitted the article and closed my laptop with satisfaction. Miguel was washing brushes in the kitchen sink, the blue paint already transformed 2 walls into something bold and fresh. "How's it going?" I asked, joining him at the counter. "Good. Should finish the kitchen today, maybe start on touch-ups." "And then you're done?" "Tomorrow, probably." The thought of him leaving filled me with unexpected sadness. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of his presence, the quiet companionship, the way the apartment felt more alive with him in it. "You'll miss this place," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Why do you say that?" "You seemed different than when I started, more here." He was right. I did feel more present, more awake. Whether it was the paint or something else, I couldn't say. "Miguel!" He looked at me, brush still in his hand, water dripping from the bristles. "Thank you for this, for making it feel like home again." "You did that. I just changed the colors." But we both knew it was more than that. Something had happened in these 4 days, something neither of us was quite ready to name. The apartment was being transformed, yes, but so was I. And maybe, I thought as I watched him return to his work, so was he. The afternoon passed quickly. He finished the kitchen as the sun began to set, and I made dinner for both of us. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, which we ate on the living room floor among the drop cloths and paint supplies. It felt natural, domestic in a way that surprised me. "You don't talk much," I said as we cleaned up. He paused, considering the observation. "Maybe I'm afraid of what I'll say." "What do you mean?" But he just shook his head, smiling slightly, and began packing up his equipment. I helped him carry things to the hallway, and we stood by the door in the growing dusk, both reluctant to end the day. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Yeah, last day. Last day." There was something final about the way he said it, like he was acknowledging more than just the end of the painting job. After he left, I walked through the nearly completed apartment, seeing it with fresh eyes. The gray walls were warm and sophisticated, the blue kitchen cheerful and bright. It was beautiful, transformed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was ending along with the work. I spent the evening on the balcony with a book, watching the city lights come alive in the darkness. Tomorrow, Miguel would finish the touch-ups, collect his payment, and walk out of my life as suddenly as he'd entered it. The thought made my chest tight with something I didn't want to examine too closely. Saturday morning was crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made the city feel full of possibility. I woke early and made coffee, stronger than usual, dreading and anticipating Miguel's arrival in equal measure. He knocked at 8:30, carrying a small toolbox and what looked like the last of his supplies. Today he wore jeans and a dark green Henley that made his eyes look almost hazel in the morning light. "Morning," he said, accepting the coffee I offered. "Should be done by noon." "That fast?" "Just touch-ups left. Minor stuff." We drank coffee in the transformed kitchen, surrounded by the blue walls that had become familiar over the past few days. But something was different today. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, a weight that made ordinary conversation feel impossible. Miguel seemed to feel it too. He finished his coffee quickly and got to work, moving through the apartment with focused efficiency. I tried to write but found myself watching him instead, memorizing the way he moved, the careful attention he paid to detail. Every few minutes our eyes would meet across the room and I'd feel that familiar jolt of connection, stronger now than it had been at the beginning. By 11, he was nearly finished. The apartment looked perfect, clean, fresh, completely transformed. It was everything I'd wanted, but instead of satisfaction, I felt a hollow sadness growing in my chest. "That's it," he said finally, stepping back from the last wall he'd touched up. "All done." I walked through the space with him, inspecting his work, but mostly just trying to postpone the inevitable. The apartment was beautiful, more beautiful than I'd imagined it could be, but in a few minutes he'd pack up his tools and leave, and I'd be alone again in my perfectly painted space. "It's amazing," I said, and meant it. "Thank you. You're welcome." We stood in the living room, surrounded by folded drop cloths and empty paint cans. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, making the gray walls glow soft and warm. It should have been a moment of completion, of satisfaction, but all I felt was loss. "I guess I should get out of your way," Miguel said, reaching for his toolbox. "Wait." He looked up, surprised by the urgency in my voice. I didn't know what I wanted to say, only that I wasn't ready for this to end. "Do you want some lunch before you go?" He hesitated, and I could see him weighing something in his mind. "Sure, if you want." I made sandwiches while he finished packing his equipment, both of us moving carefully around the kitchen, hyper-aware of each other's presence. When I reached past him for plates, my arm brushed against his back, and I felt him go still. "Sorry," I murmured. "It's okay." But neither of us moved away. We stood there for a moment, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could count the paint stains on his shirt. Then he turned, slowly, until we were facing each other in the narrow space between the counter and the island. "Alex." "Yeah?" "I should go." I know, but neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, charged with 4 days of careful glances and unspoken thoughts. I could see the pulse beating in his throat, could smell the clean scent of his skin mixed with paint, and something else, something that was just him. "This isn't," he started, then stopped. "Isn't what?" "Professional." I almost laughed. "No, it's not." His eyes searched my face, looking for something I wasn't sure I knew how to give. "You just got out of a relationship." 3 months ago. That's not very long. Long enough. He shook his head, but he didn't step away. If anything, he seemed to lean closer, drawn by the same invisible force that had been building between us all week. "I don't want to be a rebound." "You're not." "How do you know?" I thought about it, about David and the slow erosion of our relationship, about the months of feeling disconnected and alone even when we were in the same room, about the way Miguel had seen me from the first day, really seen me, in a way David never had. Because he never made me feel like this. Like what? Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something deeper, more vulnerable. He lifted his hand slowly and touched my cheek with the backs of his fingers. His skin was rough from work, but warm, so warm. "We should eat," he said quietly, but his hand didn't move. Yeah, neither of us moved. The sandwiches sat forgotten on the counter behind us as we stood in the bright kitchen, caught in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. I could hear my heart beating, could see the pulse jumping in his throat, could feel the air itself holding its breath. Then his thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I leaned into the touch without thinking. His eyes darkened, and I knew he was going to kiss me, knew it as certainly as I knew my own name. But at the last second, he pulled back, dropping his hand to his seat. "Lunch," he said, his voice rough. "Right." We ate in the living room, sitting on the floor among the painting supplies like we had the night before. But everything was different now. The casual comfort had been replaced by something electric, every accidental touch sending sparks through my nervous system. When he handed me a napkin, his fingers brushed mine and we both froze. When I reached for my water glass, my shoulder bumped against his and I felt him inhale sharply. "So what happens now?" I asked when we'd finished eating. "With your next job, I mean." "I've got a house in Park Slope starting Monday. Big Victorian, needs a lot of work." "Sounds like a good project." "Yeah, should keep me busy for a few weeks." We were making small talk, dancing around what we both knew was happening, what we both felt building between us. The apartment felt different with the work finished, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. "Miguel." "Yeah?" "I don't want you to go." He looked at me for a long moment, his dark eyes serious. "Alex, I know it's complicated. I know it doesn't make sense, but these past few days—" I trailed off, searching for words that felt inadequate. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." "Then why does it feel like you're about to walk away?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've been where you are. After someone leaves, when you're trying to figure out who you are without them. And sometimes you grab onto the first person who makes you feel something, anything, because feeling nothing is worse. Is that what you think this is? I don't know. Maybe." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that what I felt for him had nothing to do with David or loneliness or the need to fill an empty space. But how could I be sure? How could anyone be sure of anything when their world had been turned upside down? "What if it's not?" I asked instead. "What if it's something else?" He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the moment he made his decision. "Then we'll figure it out." "Together?" "Together." The word hung in the air between us, full of promise and possibility. We were still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the detritus of his work week, but something fundamental had shifted. The apartment was finished, transformed, but maybe that wasn't the only thing that had changed. As the afternoon light began to fade, we moved to the couch, talking quietly about nothing and everything. He told me about the paintings he'd stopped making, about the way creativity could become tangled up in expectation and fear. I told him about the stories I kept in notebooks, about the way writing sometimes felt like bleeding onto the page. "Why don't you try again?" I asked. "Painting, I mean." "Maybe I will." I could write about it, artists finding their way back to their work. It could be a good story. "You'd want to write about me?" "I'd want to write about anyone brave enough to try again." He smiled at that, and I felt something warm unfurl in my chest. We were building something, I realized. Not just attraction or chemistry, but understanding, connection. The kind of thing that couldn't be rushed or forced, only discovered. As evening approached, Miguel began gathering his remaining supplies. I helped him carry everything to the door, both of us moving slowly, reluctant to break the spell of the day. "So," he said, standing in the doorway with his toolbox in hand. "So, I should probably give you my real number in case you need touch-ups." I laughed. "Just for touch-ups?" "Among other things." He pulled out his phone and we exchanged numbers, fingers brushing as he handed me his device to enter my contact information. Such a simple gesture, but it felt significant, like we were crossing some invisible line. "I'll call you," he said. "When?" "Soon." "How soon?" He smiled, and I saw something playful in his expression that I hadn't noticed before. "Soon enough." After he left, I walked through the apartment slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The gray walls were perfect, sophisticated and warm. The blue kitchen was bright and cheerful. The cream bathroom felt like a spa. It was everything I'd wanted, everything I'd hoped for when I decided to change my space. But more than that, it felt like home. Not because of the paint, though that helped, but because of what had happened within these walls over the past week. I'd been seen, really seen, by someone who understood the value of quiet, the power of careful attention, the way small gestures could carry enormous weight. I made dinner and ate it on the balcony, watching the city lights come alive in the darkness. My phone sat beside me on the small table, and I found myself glancing at it every few minutes, wondering when he'd call, what he'd say. But mostly I thought about the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen, the careful touch of his hand on my cheek, the promise in his voice when he said we'd figure it out together. Whatever this was, this connection, this pull, this feeling like coming alive after months of sleepwalking, it was real. It was worth exploring. I was ready to try again. Part 2. But Sunday never came. Instead, it was still Saturday night, still the same evening light filtering through the windows of my transformed apartment. Miguel hadn't left yet. We were sitting on the living room floor among the drop cloths and paint cans, the ghost of dinner between us, empty plates pushed to one side, the remains of a bottle of wine I'd opened without really thinking about it. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but weighted with something neither of us had named yet. He was leaning back against the couch, legs stretched out in front of him, and I was cross-legged on the floor nearby, close enough to reach out and touch him if I wanted to, and I did want to. That was the problem. Or maybe it wasn't a problem at all. "I don't know what this is," he said finally, his voice quiet in the growing darkness. "But I don't want to stop feeling it." The words hung in the air between us like a confession, raw and honest in a way that made my chest tight. I looked at him, really looked, taking in the paint stains on his shirt, the way the evening light caught the angles of his face, the careful vulnerability in his dark eyes. I didn't speak at first, couldn't. There were too many words crowding my throat, too many things I wanted to say but didn't know how to shape into sounds. So instead, I leaned forward, slowly, hesitantly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to. He didn't. Our faces were inches apart now, close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. My heart was beating so loud I was sure he could hear it, but neither of us moved. We just stayed there, suspended in that space between wanting and having, between the safety of distance and the terrifying possibility of connection. "Alex," he whispered, and my name on his lips sounded like a question. "Yeah. I've never, not with anyone." The admission was barely audible, but it hit me like a physical thing. I thought about David, about the relationships that had come before him, about all the ways I'd tried to fit myself into shapes that never quite worked, about the way I'd always felt like I was performing some version of myself, never quite authentic, never quite real. "Me neither," I said, and the truth of it surprised me. "Not like this." He reached up then, slowly, and touched my face with the backs of his fingers. The same gesture from the kitchen, but different now, charged with something deeper. His skin was warm and rough from work, and I leaned into the touch without thinking. "What are we doing?" he asked. "I don't know." "Are you sure about this?" I thought about the question, really considered it. Was I sure? 3 months ago, I'd been living with David, thinking I understood what I wanted, what love was supposed to feel like. But sitting here with Miguel, feeling the careful weight of his attention, the way he seemed to see straight through to the parts of myself I kept hidden, this felt like the first honest thing I'd experienced in years. "No," I said, "but I'm sure about how you make me feel." Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something softer, more open. He moved closer, or maybe I did, until there was barely any space between us at all. I could smell the clean scent of his soap, could count the paint flecks in his dark hair, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When he kissed me, it was nothing like I'd expected. Not desperate or hungry, but careful, tentative, like he was asking a question with his mouth. His lips were soft and warm, and the kiss was barely there, the gentlest brush of skin against skin, so light it might have been imagined, but it changed everything. I felt something crack open in my chest, some wall I'd built without realizing it. The kiss deepened slightly, still careful, still questioning, and I found myself answering with my whole body, leaning into him, my hand finding the solid warmth of his shoulder. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads resting together in the dim light of the apartment. His eyes were closed, and I could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. "Jesus," he whispered. "Yeah." We stayed like that for a long moment, close enough to share breath, both of us trembling slightly with the magnitude of what had just happened. It had been such a small thing, barely a kiss at all, but it felt like crossing a line we couldn't uncross. "We should," he started, then trailed off. "What?" "I don't know. Talk about this, maybe?" But talking felt impossible. How could I explain the way my chest felt too small for my heart, the way every nerve ending seemed to be singing? How could I put into words the feeling that I'd been sleepwalking for months and had only just woken up? Instead, I lay back on the floor, staring up at the ceiling. After a moment, he did the same, our shoulders almost touching on the paint-spattered drop cloth. The apartment was quiet around us, filled with the kind of silence that felt sacred, untouchable. "The paint smell is getting to me," I said, though that wasn't really true. I just needed something to say, some way to fill the space without talking about what had just happened. "It'll fade in a few days." "Will you?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt him go still beside me. When I turned my head to look at him, his profile was serious in the dim light. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know what to think." He turned to face me then, propping himself up on one elbow. "I'm not going anywhere, Alex. Not if you don't want me to." "What happens when this job ends?" I asked, echoing the fear that had been growing in my chest all day. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words. "I don't know," he said finally. "But you're still here now. I'm still here now. Maybe that's enough for tonight." I wanted to argue, to demand guarantees and promises and a clear map of where this was heading, but there was something in his voice, in the careful way he was looking at me, that made me understand that certainty wasn't what this was about. This was about the present moment, about the weight of his attention, about the way the air between us felt electric and alive. "Okay," I said. "Okay. Tonight is enough." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. He looked younger, less guarded, and I felt something warm unfurl in my chest. We lay there as the light faded completely, talking in whispers about nothing important. He told me about the house in Queens where he'd grown up, about his mother's garden and the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the mornings. I told him about the small town where I'd spent my childhood, about the library where I discovered that words could be magic, about the day I decided to move to the city and try to make a living with stories. His hand found mine in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a casualness that felt anything but casual. His palm was warm and calloused, and I found myself studying the way our hands fit together, the contrast between his darker skin and mine. "Tell me something true," he said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "Something you don't tell most people." I thought about it, sifting through the various truths I kept locked away. "I used to write poetry," I said finally. "Bad poetry. When I was in college, I thought I was going to be the next great American poet." "What happened?" "I got older, got practical, started writing articles that paid the bills instead of poems that made me feel like I was going crazy." "Do you miss it? Every day?" He squeezed my hand gently. "You should try again." "Maybe." "I'm serious. Life's too short to ignore the things that make you feel alive." There was something in his voice that made me turn to look at him in the darkness. "Is that what you're doing? With painting, I mean. You're painting." "Maybe. I don't know yet." We fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable silence now, charged with possibility rather than uncertainty. I was hyper-aware of every point where our bodies touched. Our hands, his shoulder against mine, the way his breathing had synced with mine without either of us noticing. He never said much, I thought, but somehow he saw through me like no one ever had. Around 10, the building's buzzer jolted us both back to reality. The harsh electronic sound cut through the quiet apartment like a knife, and we both froze, hands still intertwined, hearts suddenly racing. "Are you expecting someone?" Miguel whispered. "No." The buzzer sounded again, longer this time, more insistent. I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, the murmur of voices. My upstairs neighbor, probably having forgotten his keys again. But the interruption had broken the spell of the evening. Miguel sat up, running a hand through his hair, and I could see him retreating, walls going back up that I hadn't even realized had come down. "I should go," he said. "You don't have to. It's late." I wanted to argue, to point out that it wasn't really that late, that we'd been building something beautiful and fragile and he was about to walk away from it. But I could see the uncertainty in his face, the way he was second-guessing everything that had happened between us. "Okay," I said instead. He gathered his remaining supplies quickly, efficiently, the easy intimacy of the past few hours replaced by something more formal, more distant. I helped him carry things to the door, both of us careful not to let our hands brush, both of us pretending that the careful distance was normal. "Thank you," I said as he shouldered his toolbox, "for everything. The apartment looks amazing." "You're welcome." He paused in the doorway, and for a moment I thought he might say something else, might acknowledge what had passed between us, but he just nodded and stepped into the hallway. "I'll see you around, Alex." "Yeah, see you." I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. The apartment felt enormous and empty without him, despite being exactly the same size it had always been. I walked through the freshly painted rooms, touching the walls that still smelled faintly of paint, trying to hold on to the memory of his presence. In the living room, the drop cloths were still scattered on the floor, the wine glasses still sitting on the windowsill. Evidence of an evening that had felt monumental, but might have been nothing more than two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. I cleaned up slowly, folding the drop cloths, washing the glasses, putting the furniture back where it belonged. With each task, the apartment returned to normal, but something inside me had shifted permanently. I could still feel the ghost of his kiss, still smell the clean scent of his soap on my skin. I went to bed that night in my freshly painted bedroom, staring up at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the evening. The careful way he'd touched my face, the whispered confessions, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious and fragile. But more than that, I kept thinking about what he'd said. "I don't know what this is, but I don't want to stop feeling it." Neither did I. Morning came gray and drizzly, the kind of Sunday that made the city feel muted and soft. I woke early, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. The apartment looked perfect in the morning light, sophisticated, peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for when I decided to make a change. But it felt empty without Miguel's quiet presence, without the steady rhythm of his work, without the possibility of catching his eye across the room and feeling that jolt of connection. I tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. I tried to read, but couldn't concentrate. Instead, I found myself walking through the apartment, touching the walls he'd painted, remembering the careful attention he'd paid to every detail. Around noon, I gave up on productivity and decided to run errands. I needed groceries, needed to pick up dry cleaning, needed to do all the mundane tasks that make up a life. But as I reached for my jacket, I heard something that made me freeze. A soft knock at the door. Not the sharp rap of a neighbor or delivery person, but something gentle, almost hesitant. I stood in the hallway for a moment, heart racing, afraid to hope. Then I heard a voice, barely audible through the door. "If you want me to come back, I will." Miguel. I pressed my hand against the door, closed my eyes, and felt something settle into place in my chest. Yesterday had been real. Last night had been real. And now he was here, offering something I'd been afraid to ask for. I reached for the doorknob, ready to let him in, ready to see where this strange and beautiful thing between us might lead, ready to stop being afraid of what I might feel, what I might want, what I might become. Ready to try again, together this time. The door opened, and there he was, rumpled from sleep, paint still under his fingernails, looking at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. "Hi," he said. "Hi." And in that moment, standing in the doorway of my transformed apartment, I understood that some things couldn't be planned or predicted or controlled. Some things just were, beautiful and terrifying and real, like fresh paint on old walls, like the space between one breath and the next, like the possibility of love when you'd stop believing in it. Some things were worth the risk of being hurt again. Some things were worth everything. E.